Today, you are going to watch me react live to the very first interview Tucker Carlson gave after he spoke to Putin. This is going to be a good one, folks. I hope and pray you'll be blessed. All right, folks, we got another great one for you today. As you remember, last week, I got to do something that I thoroughly enjoyed, and looks like many of you guys enjoyed doing it. I watched Putin's interview that Tucker Carlson conducted live, and I reacted live, which, by the way, some mistakes came out of my live reaction. Like, for example, I kept saying Japan when I was thinking China in my head. And as a matter of fact, when I rehearsed it, after people pointed it out to me, I still didn't hear Japan. It's kind of funny. I do know that the yuan is different from the yen, but anyway, those types of things happen. But what we're going to do today is the same thing. I am going to react live to Tucker Carlson actually talking about his Putin interview. Now, there's some other things that he's going to talk about, all very relevant. And this is him appearing at the World Government Summit 2024 that takes place in Dubai. And he is, in essence, going to talk about the Putin interview amongst a few other things. So at least that's what I've been told. This may be all about the Putin interview. I don't know, but I think it's relevant because obviously this discussion, this interview that took place was critically important, especially to Bible prophecy and things very relevant to that subject. And so that's why I think the live analysis was really important. I'm going to do it again. Again, this is a recording, but I'm going to react to it as I see it. In other words, this will be playing in front of me for the very first time, and I'll be reacting to it, and hopefully we'll cover as much as we can on the fly. This is a roughly 26-minute discussion, and I'll just react as it comes. So if you are the type of person that gets mad because I don't let people finish what they're saying, which it's never the case, I always try to do that, but people seem to not like me talking, then you won't want to watch this, because this is going to be my reaction to the things that are being said. And the whole idea is to provide some honest and really solid analysis of what's actually being discussed. Okay, so let's get into it. Tucker Carlson here talking about his interview with Putin. And as I understand it, maybe a few other things. And we'll just react live as it comes.
I'll start in reverse order. Why now? Well, I've been trying for 3 years to do this interview. The U.S. government prevented me from doing it by spying on my text messages and leaking them to the New York Times. And that spooked the Russian government into canceling the interview. And
that should actually make everybody sick to their stomach. But we know that the government has been interfering with free speech. We know that the government has been directly, especially the United States government, has been directly opposing anybody who will preach the gospel or speak the truth or want to bring the truth out. Certainly Tucker Carlson isn't speaking the gospel here, preaching the gospel, but he is wanting to tell the truth. And they continue to interfere with his attempt to do so, just like they do it with all of us, in that many of them control big tech, and big tech will put restrictions on the things that we say, and we all know that to be true. Don't get me wrong. I am very thankful for platforms like Rumble and YouTube. Rumble, of course, is not nearly as guilty of this as YouTube might be, but I'm thankful for those platforms, and they can do whatever they want with their platforms, so we try to work around their guidelines, but we always want to tell you the truth, and we do know that censorship is a real thing. It's really happening, and in this case, this is the government actively seeking to get involved in stopping Tucker talk to Putin. Why? Because Putin very likely may talk about things that the government doesn't want us to know about, and I'm certain that's where Tucker is going with this. So it's kind of interesting stuff here. Let's get on with it.
I've been trying to do this, but my country's intel services were working against me illegally, and that enraged me because I'm an American citizen. I'm 54, I pay my taxes, I obey the law. And there was no expectation in the America that I grew up in that my government and its intel services, NSA and CIA, which were always outwardly focused on our foreign enemies, would be turned inward against American citizens. And I'm shocked by that, and I'm infuriated by that. And so once I discovered that that was happening, and I confirmed it was happening, and they admitted that they did it, then I was totally determined, monomaniacally dedicated to doing this interview, not simply because I want to know what Vladimir Putin is like and what he thinks about a war that is resetting the world and really gravely damaging my country's economy, but also because they told me I couldn't. on the basis of illegitimate means and for no really clearly stated justification. And I thought that can't stand. I want to live in a free country. I was born in one. And I'm going to do whatever small thing I can do to maintain, the society that I
okay.
And I want to say this. This is a lot more valid for a lot more reasons than people might think. Tucker's saying that he's enraged because of the fact that his freedom was taken away from him. And in essence, when that happens to him, it's taken away from us, right? But you also have to keep in mind, the government of the United States of America has turned their back on the Lord because the people have turned their back on the Lord. So the further away they get from the Lord, the further away they're going to get from freedom. They hate freedom. And one of the things that has kept our country so strongly together, besides the fact that we have always had a love for the Lord, and that kind of kept us safe and pure and watched over, one of the bigger issues, and it is a massive issue, is the fact that we allow people to speak freely. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, because when you walk away from God, you walk away from things like freedom, you walk away from free speech, and that's what we're actually seeing here. And this is a very, very important aspect of our discussion.
I love.
You are known to be pro-Republican Party, right wing of Republican Party.
Which, by the way, is just interesting. This guy, his name is Ahmad Eldin Adib, and I don't know who he is, but automatically he's already attacking Tucker, saying Tucker is this pro-Republican person, when in reality, if you know Tucker, Tucker's far from that. Tucker is just pro-truth. As a matter of fact, Tucker is very disgusted right now by the Republican Party, as am I. So this is worth pointing out. It is kind of cool, by the way, to see a little bit of pushback here, because I hope what it ends up doing, and again, I haven't seen this yet, but I hope it ends up causing Tucker to bark back. And I think it'll be good if it does, because if he does bark back and is not completely guarded, we may end up getting a lot more information than we think, and it's fixing to be good. So, man, I need to bring the popcorn when I react to these things.
This is what they claim. They said first you've been a Democrat,
That's not
and
true.
became a Republican. Okay. Or you are known to be pro-Trump, anti-Biden. What is truthful in this? And you went to Putin because you are pro-Trump and anti-Biden?
Okay, so it's a fair question. I mean, his questions are based on the perception that exists in areas near the UAE, in Dubai. You do have to keep in mind, Dubai, the UAE, Saudi Arabia has a lot of respect for Trump, not so much respect for Biden. And the reason for that is because of how Biden has abandoned the position of the United States of America to stand by their allies in the Persian Gulf against the nonsense of Iran. So they're also feeling a little bothered by this. And this is a very important discussion for them to have. They want to know what the general sort of think tank in the United States of America is sort of siding with. So it makes sense that this question's being asked. It's a fair question, okay? And some of it, again, is based on Mideast's perception of what's going on in American politics, which is never completely always accurate, but it does lend for enough facts to be able to ask a reasonable question, and this question seems to me to be relatively reasonable.
I mean, my views are not very interesting. I'm not sure how I would characterize them. They're changing as quickly as the world itself is changing. And as a matter of principle, I think that, that your views should change when the evidence changes, and assumptions that you had in the past are proven wrong. That has happened to me virtually every month of my life. If you pay close enough attention, you can rate your own performance, just as if you're betting on sports.
By the way, I think that this is a very biblical perspective. Tucker doesn't know that he's speaking it biblically, but if we do not stand or allow ourselves to stand to be corrected by the truth, then we end up destroying ourselves. And people who walk closely with the Lord always put themselves up against the measuring stick of God's word and allow the word of God to change them. And clearly Tucker Carlson's views are being changed pretty rapidly, because he doesn't seem to have the complete foundation and guidance of the scriptures, although he claims I think a Lutheran affiliation. He's not really guided by any of that. He does consider himself to be a Christian for the sake of a title or association with religious affiliation, but he's not really quite there. But there's a lot of these things that are happening around him that are causing him to reconsider all of that. And I'm not speaking for him. These are just my general observations. And it's because we are living in a very spiritual world. And this battle is very spiritual. And I think that's why this is all happening. And this is an important point to be discussing.
You know, I lost that one. And when you do, when it turns out that the things you thought were true were lies, you should admit it. So what are my views? I'm not certain. Tell the truth is my main view, and I plan to do that to the best of my ability. So Trump played no role in this whatsoever. There's obviously an election in my country coming to fruition in November. I have no idea what's going to happen. I think that the current administration is very obviously incompetent, and the president is senile. That's not an attack. Everyone knows it. It has now been confirmed, I would say, this week in the report that you're all familiar with. But
yeah, which, by the way, just so that you know, there's an intelligence report that has come out that basically says that Biden is losing his facilities, and that's kind of the idea. The idea is that his general competence is diminishing, and that his old age is dramatically affecting his capacity to do what he does. And that's the basis, by the way, for which they are choosing to refrain to file criminal prosecution against him because of the criminal acts that he has committed with respect to the release of classified documents. So they certainly won't do that with Trump, but they are going to do it with Biden. And I think that they're going to be happy to do it with Biden because that will be their excuse by the time of the DNC to remove him and put somebody in like Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom or something like that. The other thing that I think is worthwhile pointing out, and one that's really critical to point out, is that, yes, Biden may very well be incompetent, and I would certainly agree with that, but his handlers are not. And the type of destruction that we're actually seeing happening in the United States of America is very calculated, it's very nefarious, and it is undoubtedly tied to some ridiculous cabal that is seeking to gain very nefariously power and control over the whole world, and they want to use the United States of America as a launching pad for that to happen. That's my view.
And that's very sad, but it had sort of nothing to do with the interview. I wanted to interview Putin because he's the leader of a country that the U.S. government is sort of at war with, though not in a declared way.
Sir, you know your President Biden well.
Yes, I do.
You've been working in several media organizations, from PBS, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, and you've been covering this field well, and you know the American politicians. And now you've been following Putin, and you did a very lengthy interview with this gentleman. And for sure, to interview him, you did your homework and you did your research. Comparing the culture, the competence between Vladimir Putin and Biden, how do you see the two men now running the world?
Okay, pay very close attention to what I think he's going to say. I have not seen this video yet, but I would bet you my bottom dollar that what Tucker Carlson is going to do is that he is going to lend a very favorable outlook on Putin, because if you compare him to Biden, he undoubtedly deserves a lot better of a review, okay? And I personally am not willing to argue that Putin is less nefarious than Biden is. I think Biden can be worse because Biden is willing to sell the country and the people of this country at the highest price so that he can selfishly consume it upon him and his family. He's already proved that to be the case. So if Tucker gives a positive review on Putin, I would not be surprised. As a matter of fact, I would kind of expect it. Let's see what he says.
I mean, if this were boxing, the fight would be called by the medic. And I say that as an American.
If this were boxing, the fight would be called by the medic. In other words, there's no chance, right? Biden gets knocked out in this one. Biden would not be conscious. It's a wrap. Putin is a million times better of a leader. Now, we're not talking about the principles that people stand for, but he is definitely a more competent leader and certainly a more aggressive leader. That makes certain. Matter of fact, when you look at the interview between Putin and Tucker, you'll notice right away, Putin made it very clear he was the boss, right? He showed up to the interview 2 hours late, and then he pretty much threw Tucker right off at the very beginning and then went into a lengthy history discussion, which I think was very viable. I think it was a very useful discussion, but he clearly showed who was in control. And he would do that with anybody. I mean, Putin is going to do it with anybody. He's ex-KGB. He's a very aggressive leader, and he certainly does his homework. He knows things about people. As a matter of fact, there's a certain point where he mentions that Tucker applied for the CIA, and Tucker looked shocked because it's probably a fact that nobody really knew. Kind of interesting to see that. But let's see what Tucker says.
And I don't have another passport. I don't plan to ever leave my country. My family's been there hundreds of years, and I love it. I am a patriotic American. And I grieve when I see that the president is non compos menace, and that in my country, it is considered very rude to say that. And you sort of wonder, how did you get to a place where you have an incompetent president who's driven not simply the standard of living, but life expectancy downward, and no one feels free to say that? That's not a political observation. It's a statement of fact, which is provable empirically.
And that's true. And there's many opinions that we are not allowed to share publicly, because if we share those things publicly, there will be grave consequences, whether it be people losing their livelihoods, whether it be in some cases people losing their lives, whether it be people being imprisoned. We're watching. Listen, we had people right now that are being charged by the federal government because they're speaking against school board members. We have some people right now doing a multi-year jail sentence over going to an abortion mill and very peacefully speaking against the evils that are being done there. Singing, they're totally allowed to do it, but they're taking advantage of some weird, twisted form of a federal statute to put these people in jail. Why? They want to intimidate them to shut up because they don't want the truth to be heard. We are in a very, it's becoming a very unfree country, and Tucker's right.
And the most radicalizing thing I would just say for me in the 8 days I spent in Moscow was not simply the leader of the country, who of course is impressive. It's the largest landmass in the world. And it's wildly diverse, linguistically, culturally, religiously. It's hard to run a country like that for 24 years, whether you like it or not. So an incapable person couldn't do that. He is very capable, and many of you know him and you know that. What was radicalizing, very shocking and very disturbing for me was the city of Moscow, where I'd never been, the biggest city in Europe, 13 million people. And it is so much nicer than any city in my country. I had no idea. My father spent a lot of time there in the 80s when he worked for the US government and barely had electricity. And now it is so much cleaner and safer and prettier aesthetically. Its architecture, its food, its service, than any country, city in the United States that you have to, and this is non-ideological. How did that happen? How did that happen? And at a certain point, I don't think the average person cares as much about abstractions as about the concrete reality of his life.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate statement, right? In other words, no one's going to really care about the abstract mechanisms that continue to be offered forward. In other words, the philosophies about political ideals or the thoughts about what something should be. What Tucker is basically saying is the proof is in the pudding. He says, I live in the United States of America, and in the last several years, we've watched it pretty much become a rat hole. You go to San Francisco, there's defecation everywhere. You go to LA, there's a ton of businesses that aren't in business anymore because most of the homeless population, half of which are illegal, are actually camping out right in front of these businesses, selling prostitutes, doing drugs, the whole 9 yards. So, the safety of a human life is radically diminishing just based on statistics. If you look at abortions, everywhere you go in this country, there's nowhere where it's getting better. It's actually getting worse. And the only places that are getting better are places that are being ran by very conservative governors that are seeking to bring the best for their states, like DeSantis, for example, or several other governors right now. So I think that there's something to be said there. If you walk into Moscow, 20 years ago, it feels like it's a dump. It's on the heels of the destruction of communism, all the other things that went down. And now if you walk into that city, it's way better than it was. Well, that should say something, right? I mean, that should actually mean something. And that's what Tucker's trying to explain here.
And if you can't use your subway, for example, as many people are afraid to in New York City because it's too dangerous, you have to sort of wonder, isn't that the ultimate measure of leadership? And that's true, by the way, it's radicalizing for an American to go to Moscow. I didn't know that, I've learned it this week. to Singapore, to Tokyo, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Because these cities, no matter how we're told they're run and on what principles they're run, are wonderful places to live that don't have rampant inflation, where you're not going to get raped.
Sir,
excuse
me.
What is that?
Excuse me. Are you anti-American model?
No, I am the...
See, that's a fair example. Like he's saying now are you anti-American? Do you hate America? And the reason why he's actually saying that, the reason why he's asking, is quite obvious, right? He's saying, hey, listen, you're talking negatively about the things that are happening in your country. So are you now anti-American? And again, there's a motive behind here. He's also a member of media. He's a member of Middle Eastern media, and that's a direction that things are going in. So, what do you expect? This reporter basically wanting to, I don't know if he's wanting to put Tucker in the light of being a traitor to his country, but Tucker is repeating a narrative that exists not only in the Middle East, but it exists in a lot of places that have these very structured and conservative approaches to family life and so on and so forth. That is, America is the place where lots of sin happens, a lot of evil things. And so by Tucker basically making that statement, he's being perceived here, and this is my initial reaction, my live reaction. He's being perceived as somebody who is a traitor to his own country. Nothing could be further from the truth, by the way, because if Tucker Carlson was a traitor to his own country, he'd just do what they all told him to do and make a bunch of money, and that'd be it, right? But that's not Tucker. Tucker cares about his country, which is why he's speaking up, because I think he really wants to save his country. It's that simple. That's just my perspective. And listen, the only person I choose to put on a pedestal is the Lord, okay? Because we only find hope in him and nobody else. But let's just give credit where credit is due. I think Tucker, in many ways, has done a lot of good in a lot of ways, especially for our nation.
Most pro-American, so I'm 54. I was born in 1969. I grew up in a country that had cities like Moscow and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Singapore and Tokyo, and we no longer have them. And what I have discovered is that's a voluntary choice. As inflation is, as you heard in that fascinating last panel, inflation is the product of choices made mostly by the central bank, not exclusively, but by policymakers. Crime, same. You don't have to have crime, actually. If you don't put, my children don't smoke marijuana at the breakfast table. Why? Because I won't allow them. It's very simple. It's a short conversation. No. And you can run your country the same way. We're not going to put up with that, so don't do it. And people understand that. Filth, graffiti, Paris, one of my favorite cities, New York, one of my favorite cities, are filthy. And part of the reason they're filthy is because people spray paint obscenities on buildings and no one cleans it up. So that encourages more people to do the same. And our policymakers, for some reason, don't notice this. London, another one of my favorite cities. You see English girls begging for drugs on the sidewalk. And I thought to myself, if I'm Boris Johnson, who briefly and very badly ran that country, I would ask myself, like, wait a second, my countrymen are begging for drugs on the street. Maybe I should do something about that. But no, he'll show up and give some speech about Ukraine and how we need to send, more cluster bombs to the brave Ukrainians.
Yeah, and this is, look, amen to what Tucker is saying, right? I mean, if you go and you look at Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia, some cities in Saudi Arabia, you go to certain parts of Southeast Asia or, other places that don't claim to have Western values, you don't see these cities in this type of condition. Many of them don't have a lot of crime. Many of them are not experiencing the kind of things that we're seeing right now all over the United States. When I was a young kid, you didn't see the kind of nonsense that we're seeing right now in San Francisco. Now, San Francisco was a place you went to go vacation. When I was a kid, you went to San Francisco if you wanted to go on a vacation because it was such a beautiful city. It isn't anymore. It's all garbage. Be interested to see what this reporter does in pushing back this guy, Adib. We'll see what he says.
What are you doing?
You mentioned Ukraine. By talking to this gentleman, President Putin, for this lengthy interview, my question is, did you had coffee with him? Did you have any off-the-record discussion before the interview?
After.
What I think is really cool is the fact that he just very quickly, he didn't even hesitate. Tucker said, yeah, I had an off-the-record conversation with him. But notice he said after. It wasn't before the interview, it was after the interview. This is the first time hearing about this. That's pretty cool. I'm really eager to see what he says about that. It should be interesting.
Did you feel during the interview or before or after that this man can make or is willing to do a historical compromise, number one, on the status of the world with the West, and number two, about Ukraine? Is he a compromiser, yes or no?
Okay, so this question is kind of being framed unfairly, but what I do think is going to be useful that's going to come out of this answer is I think that Tucker Carlson is going to reframe it. And I've never seen this video yet, but knowing Tucker Carlson's brain and how smart he is, it sounds like to me Adib is very smart too, but he seems to be very driven by his culture, and you can't really blame him for that. But what's interesting is I think that Tucker is going to reframe the statement. And again, I haven't watched this. We're all watching this together for the first time. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker basically says, yeah, Putin is willing to do it, and he will, so long as we all keep our word. The problem is we forced him into this position. Tucker might not say that, but I'm thinking he might.
Of course, right? I mean, the leaders of every country on the planet, other than maybe the United States during the unipolar period, are forced by the nature of their jobs to compromise. Compromise is part of it. That's what diplomacy is. And
so he is reframing the question. And just like I thought, is all countries have to be forced to compromise. If they're not willing to be flexible, then they're going to destroy themselves. That's pretty much where he's going. And right now, we have other countries that are involved in this game that don't want to compromise. Ukraine doesn't want to compromise. The U.S. doesn't want to compromise. Certain European nations that are in NATO don't want to compromise, although there's a growing group of nations in NATO that are darn near ready to walk away from the alliance because they don't want to get snapped by Article 5 and be forced into a war that they think will destroy them, destroy their economies and destroy their people and destroy their way of life. And I think this is where Tucker's about to go. That's what I think.
among those, his position is clearly hardening. Russia has been rebuffed by the West. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I'm not flacking for Putin. I'm an American. I'm not going to live in Russia. I don't love Vladimir Putin. I'm stating the facts. He asked Bill Clinton to join NATO. He tried to make a missile deal.
He mentioned this in the interview.
He did. That's correct. And he's mentioned it in other forums as well.
And look, I agree. And I don't know if you missed the subtlety that Tucker brought up. He said that Putin's heart is hardening. Of course it's hardening. If I was in Putin's position and I was being promised after promise after promise that wasn't kept, yeah, my heart would be hardened because I would be thinking about the thing that was best for the security and the interest of my country. Putin's not wrong in this, folks. He's not.
And NATO said, no, we don't want you. Now, if the point of NATO, the point of NATO, originally, of course, the post-war goal of NATO was to keep the Russians, the Soviets, from coming into Western Europe. It was a bulwark against the Russians. So if the Russians asked you to join the alliance, that would suggest you have solved the problem and you can move on to do something constructive with your life.
I agree. It fully suggests that the problem is solved. The moment Russia wants to go into NATO as opposed to continue to stand in opposition to NATO means you've solved the problem. But by them rejecting Russia's bid to want to jump into NATO basically says, no, we're still at war with you. And not only are we at war with you, but by not keeping your promise to prevent expansion after you've disassembled the USSR, you are creating this problem. You're making it a whole lot worse. So I think Tucker's right.
Life. But we refused. And so, I mean, just meditate on that. Go sit in the sauna for an hour and think about what that means.
Before sitting in the sauna, a question now. Final conclusion. You think that Vladimir Putin is eager for a compromise like Yalta, Sykes-Picot?
Yeah, but see, this is not fair that he's doing this, okay? And I'll continue on. But you're saying that Putin is ready for a compromise. He's looking for Tucker to concede to the idea that Putin is willing to stand in a position of weakness after he's been smashed. Well, he made all the compromises. He was forced to step up on behalf of his country, right? Now, is Putin willing to sit down and have a conversation that's reasonable? I still think he is. I think Tucker's going to say the same thing. But this guy is beginning to make associations with other situations that are, in essence, apples and oranges. They don't line up. They're not fair comparisons. And I hope Tucker shoots it down. We'll see. I don't know what Tucker's going to say.
The Ottoman Empire, Sèvres agreements.
Okay, so Tucker's laughing, so he is going to shoot it down. He has to. He knows how ridiculous it is. I mean, you're going to bring up the Ottoman Empire? Really? You're really going to bring up Turkey? Come on, man.
Any international agreement to share power and to share influence in the world with the West, if there is somebody who is willing, and Biden administration wants tension, wants war, want to exert pressure on him so that they can weaken his economy and weaken his alliance with China. This is what you are reaching?
So share the West. So he's like, well, is Putin willing to make a compromise to share with the West? Well, what he's basically asking, and let me just rephrase it, is Putin willing to bow down to allow the Western world that wants to globalize, this is the economy of the Antichrist, to develop? Is Putin willing to do that? And the answer is he's not. And by the way, let me just make myself clear. From the perspective of Ezekiel 38, Putin never will. Okay? From the perspective of Ezekiel 38, the world is going to fear Russia. The world already fears Russia. So let's just take it for what it is. Ukraine is the puppet of the West, specifically because of the clandestine operators that exist from within the country. And Zelensky he's a devil. He's an evil guy. Don't get me wrong. Putin's got a whole lot of evil in him, right? Don't get me wrong. But the reality of it is, if you want to pick the worst of the two evils, it's going to be Ukraine. They're way worse. And when I say that, I'm talking about their leadership. The people of Ukraine, heck, probably 70% of the people of Ukraine identifies themselves as being Russian. And Putin pointed that out. So all of this is, it's kind of ridiculous, right? I don't know if this is a reflection of Adib's ignorance because of the cultural subsets that keep him from understanding completely, or if this is more just a function of the regular inflammatory mainstream media, except from a different perspective. You know, this might be more of the flavor of Al Jazeera, but, this is ridiculous. That's just my reaction.
From your conclusions?
My conclusions are inchoate. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a couple of years. I have a whole new set of data to mull over, and I'm not a genius, so it's going to take me a while to figure out what I think. But at this stage, 4 days later, I would say, first of all, Yalta and Sykes-Picot are two of the worst agreements ever struck. So I hope whatever comes out of this is nothing like those.
Thank you. Thank you. He just mentioned it. They're apples and oranges. Do not even think of creating those parallels. Thank you, Tucker. Tucker just basically took him and slapped him in the face. Like, hey, stupid, come on, you know better than this. Thank you, Tucker. And, I'm glad I said it first. That's all I got to say.
But first things first, Putin wants to get out of this war. He's not going to become more open to negotiation the longer this goes on. One of the things we've learned in the course of the last 2 years is that Russia's industrial capacity is a lot more profound than we thought it was. I mean, Russia's Russia, this country we were assured was a gas station with nuclear weapons, has a pretty easy time making missiles, rockets, and artillery shells, whereas NATO doesn't. So we should think about what that means.
Yeah, and Russia's a lot more sophisticated than a lot of people think, especially with the existence of these hypersonics that are functioning quite well and all of the other things that are happening, folks. We got to wake up, okay? Because it's not all what it's cracked up to be. And I think we need to think twice about this, folks. This is very serious. We got to wake up and recognize what's really happening here.
One. Two, the West doesn't spend any time, or our policymakers in Washington spend no time thinking about, like, what are the achievable goals here? I have heard personally U.S. government officials say, well, we're just going to have to return Crimea to Ukraine. Well, you don't need to be a Russia scholar to know that's not going to happen short of a nuclear war. That's insane.
And the reason why it's not going to happen, and I think I should point this out, is because virtually everybody that's a resident of Crimea identifies themselves as a Russian. And yes, they live in Ukraine and they're happy to live in Ukraine, but they view Ukraine as Russian territory. And I promise you that Putin will never, ever, ever, ever let go of Crimea, because if he lets go of Crimea, he lets go of every single military advantage that he has. He would rather blow it all up before giving it up, and he's not going to do it. And the world knows that, and they're not going to fight him over it, because if they do, they're all going to lose. They will lose. I promise you, it's not going to happen.
Actually, so even to say something like that reveals that you are a child, you don't understand the area at all, and you have no real sense of what's possible. And so as long as our leaders, and not simply in the US, but NATO, and I really mean Germany, don't take the time to learn about what's possible, we're not going to get anywhere.
You think there is...
By the way, he rightly slaps him, right? You're a child, you don't understand the area. You don't. You don't know what you're looking at. And Tucker is completely right. Anybody that knows even a minute amount of the geopolitics of that region understand the absurdity, the literal absurdity of this. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
Big gap between the depths of understanding the philosophy of history between Biden and between Putin. You see Putin, who have studied history and who is very deep in history, and he looks like he gave you a lecture for 30 minutes concerning the history of Ukraine and its relationship with the mother Russia. Does Biden understand the law of action and reaction which moves a country like Russia?
I can't overstate how incapacitated Joe Biden is. That's not an attack. That is a fact. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. So these are not decisions Joe Biden is making. But there are capable people around Biden, and I know them. What they lack...
See, and he's right. Joe Biden's being ran by these people, and he's about to bring up something that I think is really, really, really important and really, really critical for us to see here. So let's pay attention to this.
Is any perspective at all. So a conversation with a U.S. policymaker about the history of the region would begin and end with a conversation about, of course, Chamberlain and Churchill and Hitler, period. So the American policymaker historical template is tiny. In fact, there's only one. And it's a 2-year period in the late 1930s. And everything is based on that understanding of history and human nature.
Yeah, I think he's brilliant in that statement. I think he's absolutely right. I think most people that are policymakers in the United States that are dealing with foreign policy, specifically in that region, are only going to bring up those items. They're going to bring up the influence of Churchill. They're going to bring up Hitler. And they may bring up some aspects of Russia, specifically southern portion of Russia. But the reality of it is they're going to be very narrow-minded in their understanding, and they have zero understanding of the geopolitics of the region. No understanding. If you put a map of Russia and Ukraine in front of them, they wouldn't be able to identify the difference between the two. An overwhelming majority of his policymakers look at things that way. By the way, it's this way in the Middle East. They know nothing about the Middle East. They know nothing about our culture. They know nothing about our background. They're very ignorant, and that ignorance continues to fuel the bad decision-making, which continues to put our country down a very serious path of destruction. We have to remember this. Like, this is super critical, right? This is really, really, really important.
And that's insane. And so, actually, American policymakers have convinced themselves that Vladimir Putin is going to take over Poland. And it is not a defense of Putin. I don't mean to defend Putin. I'm not a fan of Putin's, and I'm not a subject of Putin's. I'm an American. However, there's no evidence that Putin has any interest in expanding his borders. He is the largest country in the world, and it's very hard to run. They don't need natural resources. There's nothing in Poland he wants. There's nothing he will gain by taking Poland other than more trouble. If you're saying that he's going to invade Poland, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm really curious to see what this reporter is going to interrupt him over, because he's right. Russia doesn't lack natural resources. As a matter of fact, it's really interesting. The only natural resource that Russia may end up lacking may be energy resources, oil, or maybe even gold or silver or some type of metal that might be used in the production of something valuable to Russia. The only reason why I know that is because of Ezekiel 38. There has to be a hook that brings Russia back to do this, and I'm guessing it's going to be an energy resource, it's going to be oil, it's going to be gold, it's going to be something like that. That's my guess. It's what I think it's going to be. So let's see what this reporter ends up saying here.
Is a point in the interview when you asked him, are you ready to invade Poland?
Are you an expansionist power?
Expansion, yes, in Poland. He said, only if Poland launched a war on Russia.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I remember when he said that. He says, yeah, I'll attack Poland if Poland attacks me. That's fair. And if Poland did that, they would be the spearhead of NATO. In doing this. A lot of people think that Germany, in this sense, is the spearhead of NATO, which in many ways they are. But the reality of it is Poland would be the real spearhead of NATO in this if they chose to attack Russia. It's very important.
Okay. Ukraine did not launch a war on Russia, and he invaded Ukraine. Why you didn't follow up on this question?
Well, that's a stupid, forgive me for saying this, I'm just going to respond. What a stupid, arrogant, no, I'm not arrogant, it's just an ignorant question. That guy just demonstrated to me that he has absolutely no understanding of the region, the history, the geopolitics. Putin did what he did because he was forced into doing it, right? NATO started talking about expansion. The expansion of NATO would have taken away from Russia's sovereign capacity, and it would have accelerated the problem that Russia would have faced if Ukraine became a member of NATO. And instead of Ukraine going, hey, kids, you're at the table, adults are supposed to be here, go back and play with all of your other classmates and let me and Putin have a conversation. Instead of him doing that, he said, oh yeah, I'll join in your corrupt thing. Well, guess what? Putin got pushed into Ukraine. Everything that happened is the exact equivalent of Russia being attacked because they, in essence, were attacked. And people don't want to think about that. People don't want to even acknowledge it, but it was, in essence, an unprovoked attack. And unprovoked attacks happen in lots of different ways, and that was one of them. So if Tucker Carlson had followed up with a question like that, Tucker Carlson would have demonstrated how incredibly stupid he is. And he's not. He's a smart guy. And by the way, I think that the reason why Putin told that big history lesson is because 99% of the people that were watching the interview, including the policymakers, don't know the history that Putin shared. So that history was designed to help people understand why he had to go into Ukraine. And there were a series of very, very ugly, concerted efforts against Putin. People do not understand that. If they understood it and they acted like adults at the table, as Tucker put it, you wouldn't have this problem. This is a critical point. So let's see what Tucker does. Tucker's laughing, and I think that's great because Tucker's about to slap him back in his corner. I think. We'll see.
I started with that question, actually. But he treated me to 35 minutes of Catherine the Great and the Rus.
Yeah, but he had to. Tucker, like, this is where I disagree with Tucker. He had to do that. When you can, Putin can't just say, well, I'm going to go ahead and attack Poland, or this is why I did. You know, if I'm not going to attack Poland, then why did you attack Ukraine? He's not going to just simply say, I attacked Ukraine because of this. He has to give the history lesson, because if the history isn't there, then their understanding of his mindset and the frame that he was in doing what he did for the best interests of his country wouldn't be there. That's why the history is there. Remember, Putin was not talking to Tucker Carlson. Putin was talking to the rest of the world. I mean, that's, if you think about it, Putin was talking to the rest of the world. He wanted to make a case. He wanted to bring people in education. And you know the worst part about that interview, that Tucker-Putin interview? That interview, because of what Tucker said at the very beginning about, I was irritated by it, we tried to make it go by, most people will blow past the history lesson. Most people will hit fast forward, not listen to anything that Putin says about the history, and then we'll just go into the other questions. And that would be a grave error, because it takes any context away out of everything that Putin says throughout the whole interview. That history was critical to every answer that Putin gave after he provided that history. And I'm sorry, I don't care what anybody says, I think he was wise to do it.
But no, the core question is, why did he move his forces into eastern Ukraine? And I watched this from a distant vantage in the United States, and I watched the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, go to the Munich Security Conference just days before that, in February of 2022, and say in a public forum, at a press conference to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, we want you to join NATO.
By the way, I don't know if you remember this, I have a video of it. When Kamala did this, I said, no human being can be more stupid in the region than Kamala Harris right now. Kamala Harris just basically started what potentially could be World War III. And I said it, I stuck to my guns. Kamala Harris may be the single-handed greatest reason why Putin felt like he had to go into Ukraine. Make no joke. Look, I'm not joking here. This is reality, okay? Just saying.
Which is another way of saying, it's a synonym for, we plan to put nuclear weapons on Russia's
You think they threw a bait for him?
Are you joking? Of course they did. And it just tells you how constipated and restricted and censored the US media landscape is, that I was the only one who said that. Well, wait a second. The purpose of diplomacy is to reach a peaceful, mutually, one hopes, beneficial conclusion to a crisis. So if you're showing up voluntarily at the Munich Security Conference and saying, hey, Zelensky, why don't you allow us to put nuclear weapons on Russia's border? You're cruising for a war because you know that's the red line. Because Putin has said that, and any close observer of the area already knows that.
Now, do you have an explanation, a reason?
And I'm interested to see what he says. Do you have an explanation? He's probably going to switch the subject, but yeah, Tucker's right. Kamala Harris, I would hate to see what it would look like if she was a president of the United States. It would be the end of half the world, which kind of has to happen in Bible prophecy. But anyway, that's a whole other story. Tucker's right. So let's see what this guy's going to ask now. Adib he doesn't strike me as a stupid man. I actually think he's probably a pretty smart guy, but let's see what happens here.
Explanation why there is this anti-war and this very negative remarks about this interview from a lot of your colleagues and a lot of politicians in the world?
One of the ways that
Now, this is going to be interesting. Sorry, I have my mouth full of ice, but I don't care. I can't wait to see what Tucker says about this, because it's okay. We're live. I'm chewing ice. No big deal. Let me just say this. There were some real lowlifes that made some comments about Tucker. Chris Wallace, for one of them. Look, Chris Wallace is a jealous loser that could never be as good as his father was. And so maybe he's just bitter about that. I don't know. But to call Tucker a useful idiot, like all these media people demonstrated how owned they are by everybody else, how willfully ignorant they are, and how absolutely foolish they are in making the assertions that they're making, because they don't know what the living heck they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. So I'm curious to see what Tucker's response is to these dummies that all said this about him.
I think I'm different is I don't like the internet, and I haven't seen any of the reaction, and I would imagine, I'm not the most popular person among my colleagues in the United States. I wouldn't have dinner with them anyway, so it's no great loss. But, I can't imagine what their motives would be. I didn't go to Russia, of course, to promote Vladimir Putin, and if that was my purpose, I'd say so, because I'm not embarrassed. I went because I felt that most Americans, in whose name all of this is being done, don't really know what's happening, and they know nothing about the guy they're supposedly at war with, unofficially. And I just felt that my job, if I have a job in this world, is to bring information to people so they can decide.
And after the day of this recording, we will now have paid almost $400 billion to Ukraine, folks. Just to give you an idea of $400 billion. $400 billion, we could put a wall around every single border in the United States of America, probably 15 times. We could solve a whole lot of problems with $400 billion. A whole lot. We could make our cities beautiful. There's so many things we could do with $400 billion. And yet, what are we doing? We're doing this nonsense. This nonsense, folks. That's what we're doing. It's ridiculous.
And so I wanted to do the longest interview I could with Vladimir Putin that contained the most amount of Vladimir Putin talking, not me grandstanding about what a great person I am. When an American journalist interviews someone like Vladimir Putin, the whole point of the interview is to say, I'm a good person and you're not. And that interview was aimed at his colleagues in the newsrooms in the United States.
I would agree. That's exactly right. There are a bunch of grandstanders that are self-righteous, that really are ugly people, and they want everybody to know they're better than everybody else. Let's see what Tucker says.
I'm a good person. Why are you such a bad person? You're committing genocide. Okay. That's not fruitful, and that's certainly not my role. I care what God thinks of me, what my wife thinks of me, and what my 4 children think of me, and that's all I care about. So I don't need to prove that I'm a good person. I want to hear Vladimir Putin talk so people in my country can assess what's happening. That's it.
I love that. Gosh, I love that. I wonder what it would be like if all reporters were like him. I'm not trying to grandstand for Tucker, but man, I wish there were more reporters like him. It makes so much more sense.
I'll use the devil's advocate.
But advocate away.
Yes. Okay. I'll tell you. You should challenge in the rules of an interview, and you're a master in your business. It's not for me to give you a lecture about that.
Well said. He is a master in his business. Let's see what he says.
But you should challenge some ideas. For instance, you didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not true. He did talk about freedom of speech, because at the end of the interview, he asked Putin to release that journalist. But that's a different story. The other thing is, Tucker just said it. The purpose of this interview was not to grandstand over American philosophy. The purpose of the interview was to let Putin speak so that people could understand what they're engaging in. I'm very grateful for how the interview was created. I think it was done well. Again, this is my first time watching this, guys. I'm watching this with you. This is interesting stuff. Okay, here we go.
About assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively,
Yes, this
because
is my
those are
question.
covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader.
Which, by the way, I guarantee you that clip that we just heard right now is going to get taken out of context by every news media cycle out there. I guarantee you they're going to take that phrase right out, okay? Leading requires killing people. They're going to take that out of context. I promise you they're going to do that. So wrong, but they're going to do it. I promise you they're going to do it.
That press restriction is universal in the United States. I know because I've lived it. Ask my former, I've had a lot of jobs. And I've done.
It almost slipped. He said, ask my former employer, Fox. He was about to kick Fox in the teeth, which they deserve to be, because I don't trust them.
Done this for 34 years and I know how it works. And there's more censorship in Russia than there is in the United States, but there's a great deal in the United States. And so, at a certain point, it's like people can decide whether they think, what countries they think are better, what systems they think are better. I just want to know what he thinks. That was the whole point.
Yes, I was very surprised about an inappropriate remark. I don't think it contains any of the what you can call gentillesse or niceties from Mrs. Clinton when she mentioned a phrase about you. I don't want to repeat it.
Oh, you're not going to hurt my feelings, don't worry.
Well, gentlemen, she called this gentleman, this honorable gentleman, that he is playing the role of a, you say it.
I didn't see it.
You didn't
She's
see
a child, I don't listen to her.
No.
How's Libya doing?
No.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, I'm dizzy. I laugh so hard. She's a child. I don't listen to her. Remember, she's one of the child that sits at the table that shouldn't be sitting at the table because she doesn't know what the heck she's talking about. And then he throws in this quick jab. Let me help you out with this. He says, ask her how Libya is doing. How Libya is doing. Ask her. Want to know why? I'll tell you why. Because Russia is in Libya because of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton opened up the door for Russia to be in Libya. You want to know why? Because Hillary Clinton got her crubby paws when she was the Secretary of State over a little town, a very, very important town that we all know as Benghazi. And it started a massive civil war. Hillary Clinton is the whole reason why Gaddafi was assassinated. That was her work. And so when you see all of that go down, Libya is in the state that it's in, and the position that other nations in the Mediterranean have enjoyed that are relatively safe has always been because the northern border of Libya has managed to secure the southern Mediterranean. Well, guess what? Russia has it now, and that's because of Hillary Clinton, because, as Tucker would say, she's a child, and she doesn't know what in the living heck she's doing. She's a complete, I'll use her words, she's a useless idiot, not a useful idiot, as she would call Tucker Carlson. And I can just tell you this right now, she's an embarrassment. She's an embarrassment to the rest of the world. She's an embarrassment to our nation. She is an absolute embarrassment to everything that is right. She is a wicked and a very, very demonically inspired woman. She's evil. But I'm glad that Tucker brought that up. I thought that was pretty funny. I thought I'd let you understand the reference that Tucker's making here. It's a safe one.
Okay. She said the useful idiot. And if you see the interview, that has nothing to do with this at all.
And the reason why he doesn't like Hillary Clinton doing this, remember, first of all, this man is from Dubai, okay? He's Middle Eastern. Middle Eastern men do not smile on women who insult other men, okay? Middle Eastern men frown on women like Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is everything that a Middle Eastern man calls ugly. Actually, Hillary Clinton is the thing that a lot of people call ugly. But the reality of it is she literally is everything that those of us in the Middle East absolutely hate. She's a terrible, terrible human being. But that's a whole other story.
He was trying to get a testimony about the world as Putin sees it. And this is exactly what we need to know, how this man thinks. Either you consider him an enemy, or you consider him a friend, or you consider him a dictator, but you should understand how the man thinks. Now,
you put it better than I could. You just described my motive right there.
Yeah, this guy understands. Look, I'm impressed with what he's saying. I really do. And he did. Adib effectively described Tucker's position. And I think that that's a very, very safe, wise statement to make. He's just looking to see the other person's position. Look, I look at guys like Pat Bet David. Pat Bet David is one of the largest growing podcasts in the world right now. Joe Rogan does this too, although I don't like Joe's mouth. I actually kind of don't like the mouths that come out of Pat's. I think they would make themselves a lot more effective in what they do if they didn't curse so much. But that's an opinion. I still think they're wonderful men. They're good at what they do because they allow people to share their view regarding a specific subject, especially when they stand in opposition to that view, right? So they're masters at what they do. They are. I don't do what they do. I do something completely different than what they do. But they're masters at what they do, and I think that we need more guys like that, right? I, for example, am not a podcaster that typically interviews people. I do a lot of interviews, but not as many as those guys do. I tend to be more of a commentator, and I bring in a biblical perspective to these matters because they all definitely need that. It's a critical, very critical issue. Okay, here we go.
Okay, sir. Now, the question is, if this is that is that, as they say in the United States, and this is the power of media, and the way the media is becoming very biased in a deep state like America, where are we going in the model of democracy in the world?
Media information.
By the way, he's going to talk about media information because he just said it, so I don't know what he's going to say. But I want to stop and bring this up because I'm kind of surprised he didn't respond to this. He said democracy in the world. Well, the problem that we have is democracy in the world is becoming the bigger problem. The United States of America is not a democracy, even though it's being ran like a democracy right now with the current regime. It's actually being ran more like a dictatorship. But we are a constitutional republic. There's a big difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic, a significant one. By the way, I've done many videos on this subject, but it is very different. It's not a popularity contest in the United States of America. Rather, it is a representative contest, which is critically important, especially when you begin to look at the interests of the overwhelming majority in the country. The republic that we have keeps people like Californians from destroying all of the union. And that's really, really important. So it'd be interesting to see what Tucker says here.
In a free country is a counterbalance against entrenched power, not just government power, but the economic power, business. It was in my country, constitutionally, it is designed to serve as a counterbalance to that. So if sources of information, media outlets align with entrenched power, then you have a powerless population, and it's totalitarian. And that is very quickly the direction the United States is headed. And I do think that technology abets this progression, and machine learning especially. And so it's a perilous moment if we're a democracy, purportedly, and a prerequisite for democracy is information so that the electorate can make up its mind and decide who to choose. And so if you don't have access to information, you don't have democracy. And we're in this sort of weird spiral where our leaders lecture us ever more about democracy and how sacred it is, even as they choke it to death. And so I think the people who provide information, who bring the facts to the public, have a critical role to play. And right now it's difficult. I'm not facing any great, I don't mean to cast myself as a hero. I'm certainly not a hero at all. But I do think it's tougher and tougher to do that. Sure. And that means we have a greater obligation to do it.
Sure.
Yeah, he's right. A big fat amen to that. And I do think that Tucker in many ways is a hero because he's willing to actually tell the truth. And a lot of people are not willing to tell the truth. And I think that's why this is really critical.
Do you have an explanation till this moment, since the Gaza events took place, till now, nobody came out and said how on earth the United States of America is vetoing the stoppage of fire, how a country would veto not to continue war? How somebody is against stopping a war?
Well, that's a valid question. I do understand that what he's doing here is he's taking a dig at Israel because he's wondering why the United States of America is not demanding a ceasefire. The only problem with that is that in order for a ceasefire to work, then the other side has to stop firing, right? And remember, there was a ceasefire in Gaza on October the 6th, and that ceasefire ended when Hamas attacked Israel. So it's not, again, it's not a fair framing. The question is not being framed fairly. And I don't think Tucker's going to point that out because Tucker is against what's going on in Gaza because he's an all-American, all the time kind of a person. He may think differently. He may surprise me. I don't know. We'll see.
The United States is, for this moment, is the most powerful country in the history of the world. So if you were to frame this in terms we're all familiar with, which are the most basic terms, the terms of the family, the United States would be dad, would be the father. And the father's sacred obligation is to protect his family and to restore peace within his walls. So if I come home, I have 4 children, if I come home from work and 2 of my kids are fighting, what's the first thing I do? Even before I assess why they're fighting, before I gather the facts and know what's happening,
I stop the fight.
I stop fighting.
Yes.
So if I come home and I have 2 kids fighting and I say, go, beat the crap out of them, I am evil. Because
he's right. He's right, but it's not that, it's not that simple. It just really isn't simple. It's not that simple. Well, let me get this right. It is that simple, but the way you do it is not that simple, okay? Think about it like this. The way you put an end to the fight in Gaza is you basically say, stop it or we're going to put you all down. It's just that simple, right? But it's not happening. So they're being forced to the alternative.
I violated the most basic duty of fatherhood, which is to bring peace, because I have the power. I'm the only one who can bring peace. And so if you see a nation with awesome power abetting war for its own sake, you have a leadership that has no moral authority, that is illegitimate. And I mean that too. I'm not even referring to any specific region or conflict. I mean generally. And I'm deeply offended by that, deeply. And it's something that I try to express, and I'm often called a traitor for saying that. It's the opposite. I say that because I believe in the United States. I think it has been a morally superior country. And if we allow our leaders to use our power to spread destruction for its own sake, that is shameful. It's a binary, okay? It's a black and white. It's a 0 and a 1. You are either creating or you're destroying. You're improving or you're degrading. And that's how you know whether something is good or bad, whether it's virtuous or evil. If you just judge the fruits. By its fruits you will know it. And I'm very distressed and concerned that we are entering an era where this awesome force for good is instead being used for evil.
2 quick questions because I ran out of time.
And I do think he's right to bring out that parallel. I think that's a fair assertion. I really do. I think that's fair.
First question is, now in the American elections, we have probabilities.
Yes.
Either it's Biden and Trump, or Biden and somebody else, not Trump, or no Biden and no Trump, and circumstances or fate get us 2 different people representing a Republican or Democrats. What do you think, where are we going to reach coming 19th of November? Who will be running the show?
Honestly, I haven't the faintest idea. But I think there's volatility ahead in our political sphere. I mean, clearly there is, because
I like you when you said, I don't have an idea. You have this courage to say that you don't know. You were telling me this morning that one of the things which you like very much about here, our President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, God bless him.
Yeah, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. There's some interesting. We don't have the time to go over this, but the unique picture that's drawn in Dubai is, man, it's an interesting story for the Middle East. It's typical in many ways, but it's very untypical. And bin Zayed is, man, there's some interesting stuff with that. Yeah, I just wish I could tell you a story, but we're near the end of our time. But one of these days I'll sit down and I'll talk about the the uniqueness of some of the rulers in this area of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. There's some really unique politics that go into play, especially in these more sophisticated countries. It's pretty cool stuff.
When you ask him a question, if he doesn't have an answer, he tell me, actually, I don't know the answer of this question.
I've never heard a leader of anything, whether it's a country or a company or a soccer team, ever in my life, in a life spent interviewing people. I've never heard a single one of them say, I don't know the answer. It's very complicated. I haven't figured it out. I've never heard anybody say that. And to me,
I think that's a tragedy. I think that's a tragedy. More people would rather pretend that they know to give you the illusion that they have an understanding, even if it's at the cost of a lot of people's lives, than they would just simply say, I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet.
that is the purest sign of wisdom, because wisdom grows from humility. Wisdom grows from the recognition that you are not God. And in the United States, we had a period where we were sort of, having this debate about, are some religions good and some religions bad? I'll tell you my view on it, and it's a hardened view. It's a sincere view. I divide the world not between Muslim, Jew, and Christian or Buddhist.
He's going to say, I divide the world between good and evil. I guarantee you that's what he's going to say. And any man that's thinking clearly and has an understanding of right and wrong will say the same thing. It'll be good and evil. That's what he's going to say. I'm going to bet you on it. I might be wrong. I don't know. It's a live reaction here. We'll see.
The world between people who believe they're God and people who know they're not. And the only people I trust are in the second category.
Yeah, people who believe they're God and people who are not. I mean, that's a fair statement. But again, it goes right back to there's a battle between good and evil. That's the real division right there.
Because that is the beginning of wisdom. When you know you are not God, that you cannot affect every change that you want, that you can't foresee the future, that you're not omnipotent, then you are much more likely to make good decisions, wise, humane decisions. By contrast, when you believe you have the power to shape the world and other people, as we were hearing this morning through biohacking, when you think you can create a better human being through technology, you're very dangerous because you don't understand your own limits. And you will get a lot of people killed when you have those false beliefs, in my opinion.
By this note, Mr. Carlson, thank you very much for giving us this chance to come for the first time after your great interview to talk to the world through this podium and this country and my humble self. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think that was such a great interview. I think that was really, really good. I do want to close on a certain thought because I do think this is really important, right? And Tucker kind of ended it, but the spirit of Antichrist is a very real thing. Matter of fact, let me read this to you. This is 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 1. I'm going to read this. It says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." And look what he says in verse 2. Hereby, which, by the way, before I read verse 2, let me just simply say, this is what should be the mindset of good reporting. If you're doing the type of thing that Tucker Carlson does well, then 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 should be the thing that drives you, right? Believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. Hereby know we the Spirit of God. Notice this: every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. Notice this: and every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof you have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. And I want to make myself very clear here, folks, when we start talking about the spirit of Antichrist, right? This phrase, Antichrist, okay, is instead of Christ. That's what it means, right? The opposition that stands against Christ stands against him in that it replaces him. So when Tucker says there's people who think they are God and people who know they're not God, Tucker is basically saying this is the spirit of Antichrist versus the non-spirit of Antichrist, right? And I think that this is something we have to look at. We know that we are living in a world right now that is filled with the spirit of Antichrist. And more than ever, what do we need to do? We need to hold everything up to the scriptures. You guys, that's our call. And when we look at interviews like this, we have to look at what the scriptures teach us to come to the conclusions that we do, because there is where we know we are going to find sound doctrine, right? And that's how we know where to go. And that's why I'm going to start doing more of these reaction videos, because I think that when you put this in light of what the scriptures teach, it changes the way you believe on so many levels, and it begins to move you and drive you in a different way. So there it is, you guys. I think this was a good one. The goal here is keep your eyes on the Lord, keep focusing on him. It's really, really important stuff. God bless you guys.